The sound of metal grinding against concrete at 3 in the morning isn't something you forget. Neither is the sight of an $80,000 Range Rover wedged halfway through your workshop door. Its pristine white paint job now decorated with streaks of rust and wood splinters. But what really burned into my memory was the woman standing beside it. Perfectly manicured nails tapping against her designer purse, acting like she owned the place. "You need to move your building," Karen Whitmore announced, her voice carrying that particular brand of entitlement that comes with being HOA board president for too long. "This structure violates 17 different community standards." I stood there in my boxer shorts and a paint-stained t-shirt, staring at the wreckage of my workshop door. 20 years of metalworking, and I'd never seen anything quite like this. The woman had literally driven her vehicle into my private property, and somehow, in her twisted logic, I was the problem. "Ma'am," I said, keeping my voice level despite the adrenaline coursing through my veins, "you just drove your car into my workshop at 3 in the morning." Karen's perfectly styled blonde hair didn't move an inch as she shook her head. "I'm conducting an emergency inspection. We've received multiple complaints about this eyesore." She gestured dismissively at my workshop, a converted garage where I'd spent the last decade crafting commissioned sculptures and custom metalwork. "The community standards clearly state that all structures must maintain aesthetic harmony with the neighborhood." The absurdity of the situation hit me like a physical blow. This woman had committed what amounted to breaking and entering, destruction of property, and possibly driving under the influence. And she was lecturing me about community standards. I could smell the wine on her breath from 6 feet away. "You're drunk," I stated flatly. "I am conducting official HOA business," she snapped back, her voice rising to a pitch that could cut glass. "And if you don't start showing some respect for community authority, you'll find yourself facing serious consequences." That's when I noticed the phone in her hand, already dialing. 3 numbers. 911. "Yes, I need to report a disturbance," she said into the phone, her eyes never leaving mine. "A man is threatening me and preventing me from conducting official community business. He's trapped my vehicle and is acting aggressively." I looked at her car, still embedded in my workshop door, and realized I was dealing with someone whose relationship with reality was more flexible than warm taffy. The police would arrive. They'd see the damage. And somehow, this would become my fault. Karen Whitmore had that talent, turning her crimes into other people's problems. But she'd made one crucial mistake. She didn't know what I did for a living. Not really. 6 months earlier, my life had been blissfully ordinary. I woke at dawn, spent my mornings in the workshop crafting custom pieces for clients across 3 states, and my afternoons maintaining the small craftsman house I'd inherited from my grandfather. Maplewood Estates wasn't the fanciest neighborhood, but it had character. Tree-lined streets, houses built in the 1940s with actual personality, neighbors who minded their own business. Then the HOA formed. It started innocuously enough. A few concerned residents wanted to maintain property values and preserve neighborhood character. They held meetings in Mrs. Chen's living room, discussing things like holiday decoration timelines and acceptable paint colors. Reasonable stuff. Karen Whitmore showed up to the 3rd meeting with a briefcase full of forms and a smile that could freeze hellfire. Within 2 months, she'd maneuvered herself into the presidency, drafted a 47-page community standards document, and begun what she called neighborhood improvement initiatives. My first encounter with the new regime came via certified mail, a violation notice for unauthorized commercial activity, because a client had seen my workshop sign and stopped by to discuss a commission. Apparently, conducting business from a home-based studio violated the HOA's vision for residential purity. Mr. Davidson, Karen had said when I called to discuss the notice, we simply cannot allow commercial enterprises to compromise our neighborhood's residential character. Perhaps you should consider relocating your hobby to an appropriate commercial district. 20 years of metalworking wasn't a hobby. It was my livelihood, my art, my identity. But explaining that to someone who viewed creativity as a zoning violation seemed pointless. I ignored the notice. The second violation came 2 weeks later. Unsightly outdoor storage. They'd cited my scrap metal pile, a carefully organized collection of materials I used for projects. To me, it was raw possibility. To Karen, it was an eyesore that needed immediate removal. I ignored that one too. The third notice arrived with legal letterhead, a cease and desist order threatening fines, liens, and legal action if I didn't comply with community standards within 30 days. The message was clear: conform or face consequences. That's when I should have realized Karen Whitmore wasn't just another busybody neighbor. She was someone who turned personal preferences into legal weapons. Someone who used authority to crush anything that didn't fit her narrow vision of perfection. But I was stubborn. I'd been welding since I was 16, had built my reputation one custom piece at a time, had clients who traveled hundreds of miles for my work. I wasn't about to let some self-appointed neighborhood dictator shut down my life's work. So I kept working, kept creating, kept believing that reason would eventually prevail. I was about to learn just how wrong a person could be. The police arrived 20 minutes after Karen's call, their red and blue lights painting the workshop walls in alternating colors. Officer Martinez stepped out of the patrol car, took one look at the Range Rover protruding from my building, and rubbed his forehead like he was developing a migraine. "Let me guess," he said, approaching Karen and me where we stood in my driveway. "HOA dispute." Karen immediately launched into her prepared speech. "Officer, this man has created an illegal commercial operation that violates multiple community standards. When I came to conduct an official inspection, he trapped my vehicle and threatened me. I demand he be arrested for kidnapping and assault." Officer Martinez looked at the car, then at me, then back at the car. "Ma'am, your vehicle appears to be embedded in his building. How exactly did he trap it?" "He moved the building around my car," Karen declared with the conviction of someone who believed her own lies. "It's a mobile structure, and he repositioned it to prevent me from leaving." I stared at her in genuine amazement. The workshop was clearly built on a concrete foundation, with utility lines running into it. Moving it would require heavy machinery and several hours of demolition work. But Karen delivered her accusation with such authority that for a moment, I wondered if I was losing my mind. "Sir," Officer Martinez turned to me, "can you explain what happened here?" "I was asleep," I said. "Loud crash woke me up. Came outside and found her car in my workshop, and her standing there telling me to move my building." The officer walked closer to examine the damage. The Range Rover had taken out the entire doorframe, scattered tools across the floor, and knocked over a display case containing several finished pieces. Thousands of dollars in damage. And that wasn't counting the destroyed artworks. "Ma'am," Officer Martinez said carefully, "it appears your vehicle struck this structure. Were you driving when the impact occurred?" Karen's face flushed red. "I was conducting official HOA business. This man has been operating an illegal commercial enterprise in direct violation of community standards. I have every right to inspect properties that threaten neighborhood values." That doesn't give you the right to drive into buildings. The officer replied, I'm going to need to see your license and registration, and I need you to step over here for a field sobriety test. This is harassment, Karen shrieked. I'm the HOA president. I'm protecting this neighborhood from criminals and code violators. You should be arresting him, not persecuting me for doing my civic duty. But Officer Martinez had already smelled the wine on her breath. Noticed the glassy look in her eyes. Observed the slight sway in her stance. The field sobriety test was a formality. Karen Whitmore was drunk, had destroyed my property, and was now facing DUI charges along with reckless endangerment and destruction of property. As they led her away in handcuffs, she turned back to me with a look of pure venom. This isn't over, Davidson. You have no idea what you're dealing with. I'll destroy you for this. I should have taken that threat more seriously. Karen posted bail 6 hours later. By noon, she was standing in my driveway again, this time with a clipboard full of official-looking documents and 2 men in cheap suits who introduced themselves as city code enforcement officers. Mr. Davidson, one of them said, consulting his paperwork. We've received complaints about multiple violations occurring on this property. Unauthorized commercial activity, improper storage of materials, and operation of equipment that exceeds residential noise ordinances. I looked at Karen, who stood behind them with a smile that could melt steel. You called in complaints. I called in crimes, she corrected. The HOA has been documenting your violations for months. Now, the city is finally taking action. The inspection took 3 hours. They measured noise levels while I operated my welding equipment. They photographed every piece of scrap metal, every tool, every finished sculpture. They interviewed neighbors, most of whom had no complaints but a few who seemed coached by Karen to mention disruptive noises and unsightly conditions. When they finished, I had 14 citations and 30 days to either comply with all regulations or face daily fines starting at $500. The choice is yours, Karen said as the inspectors packed up their equipment. You can accept that this neighborhood has standards, or you can face the consequences of your selfishness. That night, I sat in my workshop, surveying the damage from Karen's automotive assault. The Range Rover had been towed away, leaving a gaping hole where my door used to be. Wind whistled through the opening, scattering papers and sawdust across the floor. 20 years of careful organization destroyed in one moment of entitled rage. But as I looked around at my tools, my projects, my life's work, something shifted inside me. Karen Whitmore thought she could destroy me. She thought she could use bureaucracy and legal intimidation to crush anyone who didn't fit her vision of suburban perfection. She was about to learn that metalworkers don't break easily. I pulled out my phone and started making calls. First to my insurance company, then to my lawyer, then to my most important client, the one whose identity I'd kept secret for the past 5 years. Marcus, I said when he answered, it's Jake Davidson. I need a favor. The next morning brought fresh horrors. I woke to find orange spray paint covering my workshop's exterior walls. Illegal business and code violator had been scrawled across the siding in Karen's distinctive handwriting. She'd also scattered garbage across my yard and duct-taped violation notices to every window. But the real surprise was the moving truck parked in front of her house. I was hosing off the spray paint when my neighbor Tom wandered over with his morning coffee. Heard about your excitement last night, he said, nodding toward the damaged workshop. Karen's really lost it this time. She's moving out, I asked, watching uniformed movers carry boxes from Karen's pristine colonial. Tom snorted. Moving in. That's her mother, apparently. Flew in from Phoenix to provide support during this difficult time. That's what Karen told Mrs. Peterson. Anyway, as if summoned by our conversation, Karen's front door opened. A woman who looked like an older, meaner version of Karen emerged, followed by Karen herself. Even from 50 yards away, I could see the family resemblance, the pinched expression, the aggressive posture, the way they both surveyed the neighborhood like generals planning a campaign. "Great," I muttered. "Now there are two of them." "Gets better," Tom continued. "I heard Karen talking to the mailman. She's planning to run for city council next year. Wants to bring proper governance to local zoning enforcement. Apparently, dealing with your criminal enterprise is going to be her campaign platform." I stopped scrubbing paint and stared at him. "She's using this as a political launching pad." Smart, when you think about it. Nothing gets suburbanites more fired up than protecting property values and maintaining community standards. She turns you into the villain, herself into the hero protecting innocent homeowners from the dangerous metalworker next door. The implications hit me like a sledgehammer. This wasn't just about HOA rules or personal grudges. Karen was building a public narrative, positioning herself as the defender of suburban values against the chaos I represented. Every citation, every violation notice, every bureaucratic assault was being documented for future campaign materials. She wasn't just trying to shut down my workshop. She was trying to destroy my reputation, my livelihood, my entire life, all to further her political ambitions. That's when I realized I was dealing with someone far more dangerous than a simple HOA tyrant. Karen Whitmore was a sociopath who viewed other people's lives as raw material for her own advancement. But she'd made one crucial error in her calculations. She assumed I was just another suburban homeowner who would fold under pressure, pay the fines, and quietly disappear. She had no idea who she was really fighting. The revelation came that afternoon when I met with my lawyer, Sarah Chen, in her downtown office. She'd been reviewing the HOA documents, city codes, and violation notices with the intensity of someone preparing for war. "Jake, this is worse than I thought," she said, spreading papers across her desk. "These aren't random harassment tactics. This is a coordinated legal assault designed to force you into bankruptcy." She pointed to a timeline she'd constructed. "Look at the pattern. First, they establish that your workshop violates HOA rules. That's civil territory, fines, and liens. Then they bring in city code enforcement. Now it's criminal violations with daily penalties. Next week, they'll probably claim you're operating without proper business licenses, which triggers state-level investigations." I studied the documents, seeing the strategy clearly for the first time. Each level of bureaucracy brought higher penalties, more complex legal requirements, and exponentially increasing costs to defend myself. "How long before the fines become unmanageable?" I asked. "At $500 per day per violation, with 14 violations." Sarah did quick math on her calculator. $7,000 daily, starting tomorrow. Within a month, you'd owe more than $200,000. The number hit me like a physical blow. Even if I liquidated everything I owned, I couldn't pay those fines. Karen had found a way to use the legal system itself as a weapon of financial destruction. "There's more," Sarah continued. "I did some research on Karen Whitmore. This isn't her first rodeo. Before moving here, she lived in 3 other neighborhoods. In each case, she joined or formed an HOA, identified someone she considered problematic, and used legal harassment to force them out. 2 families lost their homes. 1 man declared bankruptcy. I stared at her in shock. She's done this before. It's her pattern. She targets people who don't fit her idea of suburban perfection. Artists, small business owners, anyone who stands out. She documents every minor violation, builds legal cases, and destroys them systematically. Then she uses their defeat to establish her authority and move on to the next victim. The office felt suddenly cold. Why isn't she in prison? Because technically, she's not breaking any laws. She's using legitimate legal processes, just weaponizing them. HOA rules, city codes, business licensing requirements, they're all real regulations. She's just applying them with malicious intent. Sarah leaned back in her chair, her expression grim. Jake, I have to be honest with you. Fighting this through conventional legal channels could take years and cost hundreds of thousands of dollars. Even if we win, the process might bankrupt you first. I sat in silence, processing the magnitude of what I was facing. Karen Whitmore wasn't just a neighborhood bully. She was a predator who used the legal system to destroy people's lives for sport, and I was her next target. But as I walked back to my car, something else occurred to me. Sarah was thinking like a lawyer, fighting this through courts and appeals and legal procedures. But I wasn't a lawyer. I was a metalworker, and metalworkers solve problems differently. That night, I made 2 phone calls that would change everything. The first was to Marcus Rodriguez, my most important client, and the secret I'd been keeping for 5 years. Marcus owned 3 galleries in major cities and had been commissioning my work for high-end installations. But more importantly, Marcus had connections in the art world that extended far beyond traditional galleries. Jake, I heard about your situation, he said before I could explain why I was calling. Small communities. Word travels fast. This HOA woman sounds like a real piece of work. Marcus, I need to ask you something, and I need you to answer honestly. How much is my work worth? There was a pause. Depends on the piece. Your latest installation sold for $47,000. The abstract series you did last year. Each piece is valued at $15,000 to $20,000. I'd known my work was selling well, but hearing the actual numbers still surprised me. And if I did something unconventional, something that might generate publicity, the right kind of publicity could triple those values overnight, Marcus said carefully. But Jake, whatever you're thinking, be careful. The art world loves rebels, but it destroys people who cross certain lines. The second call was to my buddy Rick, who worked for the county planning department. Rick and I had grown up together, and he owed me a favor from when I'd welded a custom gate for his wedding anniversary. Rick, I need information about my workshop. Specifically, I need to know exactly what legal status it has. Give me your address. I'll pull the files. I heard typing in the background. Okay, here we go. Your workshop is classified as an accessory structure, built with proper permits in 1987. It's grandfathered under current zoning laws, which means... Oh, this is interesting. What? According to county records, your workshop has historic designation. Apparently, your grandfather applied for it back in the 90s, when the neighborhood was being developed. Something about preserving traditional craftsmanship heritage. I nearly dropped the phone. Historic designation. Yeah, means it's protected under state preservation laws. Jake, if someone damaged a historically designated structure, that's not just vandalism. That's destruction of cultural heritage. The penalties are severe, and the state takes it very seriously. I hung up with my mind racing. Karen Whitmore had just committed a felony by driving her Range Rover into a historically protected building. But more importantly, her entire legal assault was based on HOA rules that couldn't supersede state preservation laws. She'd been using the legal system as a weapon. It was time to turn that weapon against her. But first, I had some welding to do. I spent the next 3 days preparing. First, I documented everything, photographing the damage from Karen's automotive assault, scanning every violation notice, recording video of the spray paint vandalism. Then, I began gathering materials. The beauty of being a metal worker is that you learn to see potential in everything. Scrap metal becomes sculpture. Broken tools become art installations. And sometimes, the perfect materials fall right into your lap. Or rather, crash through your door at 3 in the morning. Karen's Range Rover had left behind pieces of itself scattered throughout my workshop. Chrome trim, plastic panels, chunks of expensive German engineering that had been torn loose during the impact. She'd demanded that I pay for the vehicle's removal and repair. But her insurance company was still investigating whether her policy covered damages incurred during the commission of a crime. Which meant all those pieces legally belonged to me as abandoned property on my land. I also visited the local scrapyard and bought several hundred pounds of sheet steel, angle iron, and welding rod. The owner, Dave, was curious about my sudden need for so much material. "Big project?" he asked as I loaded the metal into my truck. "You could say that," I replied. "I'm making art." The plan was elegant in its simplicity. Karen had driven her car into my workshop, claiming she was conducting an inspection. She'd damaged a historically protected structure while operating a vehicle under the influence. She'd committed vandalism by spray painting my building. She'd weaponized the legal system to harass and intimidate me. But she'd also given me something valuable: raw materials and a story. I was going to turn her crime into art, and in the process, I was going to expose exactly who Karen Whitmore really was. On Thursday night, I began welding. The work took 18 hours of continuous welding, cutting, and shaping. By Friday evening, my workshop had been transformed into something that would have made Marcel Duchamp proud. The gaping hole where my door used to be was now completely sealed with an intricate steel framework. But this wasn't just a repair. It was a statement. I'd incorporated pieces of Karen's Range Rover into the design, welding chrome trim and plastic panels into abstract patterns that told the story of her assault on my workshop. The centerpiece was a large panel made from the vehicle's expensive German steel, hammered and shaped into the silhouette of a person driving a car into a building. Beneath it, I'd welded words from Karen's violation notices into the metal: unauthorized, illegal, violator. But the real genius was in the legal framework I'd built around the art itself. I'd contacted the State Historical Preservation Society and filed an emergency application for expanded protection of my workshop. I'd documented how Karen's assault had damaged not just the building, but potentially priceless examples of traditional metalworking heritage stored inside. I'd also registered the entire installation as a formal artwork titled "Suburban Tyranny: A Study in Institutional Violence." Marcus had provided documentation, valuing the piece at $75,000, making any attempt to damage or remove it a felony destruction of valuable property. The final touch was a small plaque I'd mounted beside the sealed door. This installation commemorates the 2023 assault on this historically protected workshop by an intoxicated HOA official. The materials incorporated into this artwork are remnants of the vehicle used in that attack, legally claimed as abandoned property. This work is protected under state and federal art preservation statutes. Karen's Range Rover parts had become part of a protected historical art installation. She couldn't remove them without committing another felony. She couldn't force me to remove them because the installation was now legally protected art. And she couldn't access the workshop to conduct any more inspections because the door was permanently sealed. But the real masterpiece wasn't the metalwork. It was what I did next. On Saturday morning, I loaded my camera gear and camping equipment into my truck and drove north toward Lake Tahoe. I'd booked a cabin for 2 weeks, far from HOA regulations and suburban politics. But I didn't go alone. Before leaving, I'd set up a time-lapse camera focused on my workshop, connected to a cellular transmitter that would upload photos to a social media account I'd created specifically for the project. Every hour, a new image would be automatically posted, showing my sealed workshop and the art installation that had once been Karen's door. I'd also sent press releases to local newspapers, art magazines, and social media influencers, describing the installation and the circumstances that created it. The story had everything suburban drama, artistic rebellion, legal intrigue, and a David versus Goliath narrative that people love. By Sunday, the story had gone viral. I sat beside Lake Tahoe, drinking coffee and watching the sunrise, while my phone buzzed with notifications. News crews were arriving at my neighborhood. Art critics were writing think pieces about suburban oppression and artistic resistance. Social media users were sharing photos of my installation with hashtags like HOA Karen and HOA Metalwork Revenge. But the best part was Karen's reaction, which I could monitor through the time-lapse camera and neighborhood social media groups. She'd apparently spent Saturday morning screaming at my sealed workshop, demanding that I open the door and remove her car parts. When that failed, she'd called the police, city code enforcement, and every bureaucratic agency she could think of. None of them could help her. The installation was legally protected art. The materials were legally mine. The workshop was historically protected and couldn't be forcibly opened without state approval. By Monday, she was standing in my yard with a sledgehammer, threatening to destroy the installation herself. That's when the cameras caught her, and that footage became the most shared video of the week. Karen Whitmore, HOA president and aspiring politician, attacking a protected art installation with a sledgehammer while screaming about property rights. It wasn't a good look for someone planning a city council campaign. The media attention intensified throughout my vacation. What had started as a local neighborhood dispute became a national conversation about HOA overreach, artistic freedom, and the weaponization of bureaucracy. News outlets interviewed neighbors, legal experts, and art critics. The consensus was overwhelmingly against Karen and her tactics. People shared their own stories of HOA harassment, turning my situation into a symbol of broader suburban oppression. But the story took an unexpected turn on Wednesday, when investigative journalists began digging into Karen's background. They found her pattern of legal harassment across multiple neighborhoods. They uncovered the financial benefits she'd gained from forcing out previous neighbors. In each case, she'd somehow managed to acquire their properties at below-market prices through her connections in the real estate industry. They also discovered that her mother's sudden arrival wasn't family support. Mrs. Whitmore Sr. was a disbarred attorney who specialized in property law and had been secretly helping Karen develop her harassment strategies. By Thursday, the story had evolved from artist versus HOA to criminal conspiracy to defraud homeowners. Federal investigators were examining Karen's financial records. The state attorney general was reviewing her previous property acquisitions. The real estate commission was investigating her license. I continued posting daily updates from my cabin, showing peaceful lake views while my installation held the spotlight back home. The contrast was deliberate, while Karen raged against steel. I enjoyed nature, while she faced criminal investigation. I created new art inspired by the mountain landscape. But the real revelation came on Friday, when one of the investigative reporters called me directly. "Jake, we found something you need to know," she said. "Karen Whitmore's real estate firm has been quietly buying up properties in your neighborhood for the past 2 years. She's been forcing out residents, acquiring their homes cheap, then flipping them for massive profits." The pieces suddenly fell into place. Karen's harassment campaign wasn't just about control or political ambition. It was about money. She'd identified my workshop as a barrier to redeveloping the entire neighborhood, and she'd been systematically removing obstacles to her profit plan. My workshop wasn't just art space. It was the last independently owned property on a block she wanted to convert into luxury condos. She hadn't been enforcing community standards. She'd been conducting economic warfare. I cut my vacation short and drove home on Saturday, arriving to find my neighborhood transformed into a media circus. News trucks lined the street, reporters interviewed neighbors, and a steady stream of art enthusiasts came to photograph my installation. But the biggest change was Karen herself. Gone was the confident HOA president who'd driven her Range Rover into my workshop 2 weeks earlier. The woman standing in her front yard looked haggard, defeated, surrounded by moving boxes and legal documents. As I pulled into my driveway, she approached me with desperation, replacing her former arrogance. "Davidson," she said, her voice cracking, "we need to talk." "I'm listening," I replied, though I kept several feet between us. "This has gone too far. The media attention, the investigations. I never meant for things to escalate like this." I looked at her with genuine amazement. "You drove your car into my building. You vandalized my property. You tried to destroy my livelihood. You harassed me with fake legal violations. And you think this escalated too far?" "I was protecting the neighborhood," she protested, but the conviction was gone. Property values, community standards. "You were padding your real estate portfolio," I corrected, "and using HOA authority to intimidate anyone who stood in your way." Karen's face crumpled. "They're going to arrest me. The federal investigators, the state attorney general, they found everything. The property acquisitions, the harassment campaigns, the coordinated legal attacks." For a moment, I almost felt sorry for her. She looked genuinely broken, stripped of the authority and confidence that had defined her for so long. But then, I remembered the families she'd destroyed, the lives she'd ruined, the systematic cruelty she'd inflicted on anyone who didn't serve her purposes. "Good," I said simply. The community meeting that Monday night was unlike anything Maplewood Estates had ever seen. The HOA had called an emergency session to address the current situation, but what they got was a reckoning decades in the making. The meeting was held in the community center, a modest building that was packed beyond capacity. Residents who'd been silent for years found their voices. People who'd been intimidated by Karen's authority structure suddenly felt free to speak truth. Mrs. Peterson, the elderly woman who lived 2 blocks over, stood up during public comment period. "I've lived in this neighborhood for 38 years, she said, her voice shaking with anger. "I watched Karen Whitmore turn our community into her personal kingdom. She destroyed the Martinez family, forced the Johnsons to sell, and harassed anyone who didn't bow to her demands." Others followed. Tom shared how Karen had threatened him with violations when he'd tried to start a neighborhood book club that didn't have her approval. The Chens described months of harassment over their garden, which Karen deemed inconsistent with neighborhood aesthetics. The Rodriguezes explained how Karen had tried to force them out by claiming their home daycare violated residential zoning laws. A pattern emerged of systematic intimidation, legal harassment, and bureaucratic terrorism stretching back years. But the real shock came when Sarah Chen, in her capacity as my attorney, presented evidence of Karen's broader conspiracy. "Ladies and gentlemen," she announced, projecting financial documents onto the community center's screen, "Karen Whitmore has acquired 7 properties in this neighborhood over the past 3 years. In each case, she used her HOA authority to create legal problems for the owners, then purchased their homes at significantly below market value." The room erupted. Neighbors who'd thought they were dealing with an overzealous HOA president realized they'd been living under a criminal enterprise disguised as community governance. Karen wasn't at the meeting. She'd already fled the state, according to her neighbors, leaving behind a house full of evidence and a community demanding justice. The HOA board voted unanimously to dissolve itself and return to the informal neighborhood association that had existed before Karen's arrival. They also voted to remove all the violations she'd issued and to cooperate fully with law enforcement investigations. But the most satisfying moment came when they asked me to address the community. I stood up slowly, looking around at neighbors who'd watched Karen's assault on my workshop, witnessed her vandalism, seen her harassment campaign. Many of them had been too intimidated to speak up at the time. Now they were applauding my resistance. "2 weeks ago," I began, "Karen Whitmore drove her car into my workshop and told me I needed to move my building. She thought she could use authority and intimidation to destroy anything that didn't fit her vision of suburban perfection." I paused, letting that sink in. But she made one crucial mistake. She assumed I would be her victim. She didn't realize that metalworkers don't break easily, and that sometimes the best response to institutional violence is creative resistance. The applause was thunderous. 3 months later, I was featured on the cover of American Craft magazine, standing beside my installation titled "Suburban Tyranny." The article described how a neighborhood dispute had evolved into a broader conversation about community, creativity, and resistance to authoritarian overreach. The installation itself had become a pilgrimage site for artists, community activists, and anyone who'd ever felt oppressed by bureaucratic tyranny. Visitors came from across the country to see the workshop where one metalworker had turned an attack into art. But more importantly, the legal consequences for Karen were severe and far-reaching. Federal investigators had uncovered a multi-state conspiracy involving property fraud, tax evasion, and abuse of governmental authority. Karen faced charges in 3 jurisdictions, with potential sentences totaling over 20 years in federal prison. Her real estate license was permanently revoked. Her properties were seized as evidence and proceeds of criminal activity. The families she'd forced out filed civil lawsuits seeking damages for emotional distress, lost property value, and financial harm. Karen's mother, the disbarred attorney who'd helped develop the harassment strategies, faced her own criminal charges for conspiracy and fraud. But perhaps the most satisfying justice was cultural. Karen Whitmore's name became synonymous with HOA abuse and suburban tyranny. Her story was used in law schools as an example of how legitimate authority structures could be corrupted for personal gain. Community organizations studied her tactics as warnings about the dangers of unchecked power. She'd wanted to build a political career on the destruction of people like me. Instead, She'd become a cautionary tale about the dangers of authoritarianism in suburban settings. The workshop door remains sealed to this day. What was once a simple garage entrance is now a protected art installation, worth more than most people's houses. The piece continues to generate income through limited edition prints, photography rights, and documentary film licensing. I've used that income to establish a legal defense fund for artists and small business owners facing HOA harassment. The fund has already helped dozens of people fight back against bureaucratic intimidation, turning Karen's attempted destruction into a source of protection for others. My metalworking business, meanwhile, has exploded. The publicity from the installation brought commissions from across the world. Museums want pieces. Collectors compete for my work. What Karen tried to destroy became the foundation for unprecedented success. But the real victory isn't financial. It's the transformation of our neighborhood. Without Karen's reign of terror, Maplewood Estates has become a genuine community again. Neighbors talk to each other without fear of violation notices. Children play in yards without worrying about aesthetic compliance. People express themselves through gardens, decorations, and home improvements without bureaucratic approval. The informal neighborhood association that replaced Karen's HOA operates on cooperation rather than coercion. When problems arise, people solve them through conversation rather than citations. When conflicts develop, mediation replaces legal warfare. It's what community is supposed to be. Tom started his book club, and it meets in different neighbors' homes each month. The Chens expanded their garden into a neighborhood sharing project where anyone can contribute plants or harvest vegetables. The Rodriguez's daycare became an officially licensed community service that other neighbors actively support. Creativity flourishes where conformity once reigned. Last week, I received a letter from Karen. She's currently serving her sentence in federal prison, having pled guilty to charges that will keep her incarcerated for the next 12 years. The letter was surprisingly introspective. She acknowledged the harm she'd caused, expressed genuine remorse for the families she'd destroyed, and admitted that her pursuit of control and profit had corrupted her completely. She also asked for something I hadn't expected: forgiveness. "I know I don't deserve it," she wrote. "I know I caused irreparable harm to you and many others, but I'm hoping that someday, when I've served my time and made what amends I can, you might find it in your heart to forgive me." I'm still thinking about that request. Forgiveness is complex. Karen's actions weren't just personal attacks. They were systematic attempts to destroy people's lives for profit. The families she forced out, the dreams she crushed, the communities she poisoned with fear and intimidation. Those wounds run deep. But I also recognize that holding on to anger would only give her continued power over my life. The installation taught me something about transformation, how destructive acts can become creative ones, how attacks can become art, how victimization can become victory. Maybe forgiveness is just another form of transformation. I haven't written back yet, but I think I will, eventually. Because the real lesson of this entire experience isn't about revenge or justice or even artistic triumph. It's about the power of creative resistance to transform not just materials, but circumstances, communities, and ultimately, ourselves. Karen Whitmore tried to reduce me to a violation notice, a problem to be solved, an obstacle to be removed. But she discovered that people aren't problems. We're possibilities. And sometimes, when you try to destroy possibility, you end up creating something far more powerful than you ever imagined. This morning, I stood in my workshop, the same space where this all began, and reflected on how much has changed. The sealed door installation continues to draw visitors, but I've built a new entrance on the opposite side. The space is larger now, better equipped, filled with projects that challenge and inspire me. Through the windows, I can see my neighbors going about their morning routines. Tom walking his dog while reading a book, the Chens tending their expanded garden, the Rodriguez children playing in a yard free from aesthetic regulations, Mrs. Peterson sitting on her porch, watching the world with eyes that no longer hold fear. It's a community that learned to value people over property values, creativity over conformity, cooperation over control. In a few hours, a film crew will arrive to shoot the final scenes of a documentary about the installation. They want to capture the workshop in its current state, productive, peaceful, protected not by legal barriers, but by community support. The documentary will premiere at Sundance next year. They tell me. Another transformation, a suburban drama becoming cinema, a personal victory becoming public inspiration. But as I prepare for their arrival, I'm thinking about the deeper transformation that this experience created. 2 years ago, I was just a metalworker trying to practice my craft in peace. I thought success meant being left alone, free from interference and bureaucratic harassment. Now I understand that true freedom comes not from isolation, but from community, not from avoiding conflict, but from transforming it, not from hiding from authority, but from creating new forms of power based on creativity, cooperation, and mutual respect. Karen Whitmore wanted to control everything around her, and in the end, she controlled nothing, not even her own fate. But through creative resistance, I discovered something she never understood. Real power doesn't come from dominating others. It comes from transforming circumstances into opportunities, obstacles into art, attacks into advantages. The workshop door remains sealed, a permanent reminder of what happens when tyranny meets creativity. But the workshop itself remains open, to visitors, to students, to anyone who wants to learn that resistance doesn't always require revolution. Sometimes, it just requires imagination. And sometimes, the best response to someone trying to destroy your world is to create something beautiful from the wreckage. The phone is ringing. The film crew has arrived. Another story begins, built on the foundation of the last one, creating possibilities that Karen Whitmore could never have imagined when she drove her Range Rover through my door in search of control. But that's the thing about creativity. It always finds a way. And it always wins in the end.